She was never useful to this family. That's what my mother said, in a courtroom, in front of a judge, in front of my brother and her pastor, and 3 women from her church, who apparently had nothing better to do on a Tuesday morning in March than watch a 73-year-old woman try to claim a house that was never hers to claim. She said it clearly. She said it with the kind of conviction that comes from a lifetime of believing you are simply reporting a fact about the world. I didn't flinch. I had a folder on the table in front of me, and I kept my hands flat on either side of it. My attorney leaned over and whispered, "Do you want to respond?" I said no. I had already said everything I needed to say 16 years earlier in a notary's office on a cold February afternoon in a document my mother had never seen and had no idea existed. My name is Patricia Abernathy, and this is the day my mother finally heard the truth she had been talking over for 40 years. Subscribe if you haven't. New story every day. The house on Sycamore Lane was not a remarkable house. 3 bedrooms, 1.5 baths, a kitchen that smelled of coffee and dish soap, a backyard with a dogwood tree my father planted the year I was born. It was the kind of house that people drive past without looking, the kind of house that is, for better or worse, everything. My parents moved in 1978. I was born that year, hospital 3 blocks away, brought home to that house on a September afternoon. My brother Derek came 2 years later, and in the way of many families, we grew up under the same roof and had very different experiences of it. Derek was the easy child. He stayed close, made local friends, married a woman my mother adored, settled 15 minutes away. He visited on Sundays. He fixed things when things broke. He was, by every measure my mother used to evaluate such things, the right kind of child. I was the one who left. Not for any dramatic reason. Mostly I left because I was 25, I had a degree in structural engineering, and there was a job in Portland I wanted. So I went. My mother never quite forgave me for deciding that my life was mine to design. She didn't say so directly, that was not her way. What she said instead, over years, in the careful spaces between other sentences, at Christmas, in phone calls, in the gaps that open at the end of conversations when someone is choosing not to say the real thing, was that choices had consequences, that some distances couldn't be closed by a check or a visit once a year, that she worried about me being alone. She was not, I want to say clearly, a cold woman. She was capable of genuine warmth, the kind that arrives before you've asked for it. The summer I moved into my first real apartment in Portland, she drove 6 hours and appeared at my door with a box of dish towels, a set of pot holders she had picked out herself, and a pot of soup she had made that morning and would not let go, cold. She sat on the kitchen floor and helped me unpack, and we talked easily for hours, and she was, that day, exactly the mother I had needed. I have never forgotten it. It sits in me alongside everything that came later, and it complicates the easier version of the story. But her warmth had conditions. The chief condition was that you had chosen the life she would have chosen for you. I had not. The life I built, purposeful, independent, geographically distant, felt to her like a comment on the life she had built. It wasn't, but she experienced it that way, and there was no conversation in 20 years of trying that changed it. I stopped reaching quite so far across that distance somewhere around the time I turned 30. I'm not proud of that. There were moments I could have tried harder. There were openings I saw and let close. By the time the rest of this story happened, it had been many years since my mother and I had spoken about anything that truly mattered between us. My father was different. He was not an effusive man. He owned a hardware store, kept careful habits, had a genuine interest in how structures held together, which is probably where I got mine. He didn't say, "I love you," freely, but he called every Sunday at 11, without fail for more than 20 years. He remembered the names of my colleagues, the details of projects I mentioned months before, the engineer I had a disagreement with in 2014 whose name he still asked about 2 years later to see how things had resolved. He remembered what I had ordered at a restaurant during a visit 4 years prior and whether I'd liked it. He had been paying attention, without announcing it, for decades. Those calls were the best part of my week. I never quite told him that. He called the hardware store Abernathy's, had opened it in 1982, and for most of my childhood it had been steady enough. Not prosperous, but steady. He had 3 employees and a loyal customer base in a town where people still came in to ask questions and expected to be answered by someone who knew the answer. He liked that. He was good at it. He could spend 20 minutes with a customer who came in for a drain snake, ask the right questions, and send them home with exactly what they needed and the confidence to use it. I have a specific memory of the kitchen on Sunday mornings when I was 10. My father would come in from the backyard with dirt on his hands, and my mother would be making coffee and the radio would be on, and neither of them said much. But the room was full of something I couldn't name at 10 and can name now, the particular ease of people who have arranged their days around each other for so long that the arrangement has become invisible, which is what contentment looks like from the inside. I thought about that kitchen often in the years after I left. I thought about it on the February afternoon I sat in Mr. Howell's office with a cashier's check in my briefcase. I thought about it in the courtroom. The recession started peeling all of that back in 2007. I could see it from Portland, what it was doing to small independent retailers, to towns that depended on local spending, to the men of my father's generation who had built their security into things they had touched and tended themselves. He didn't say much about it on our Sunday calls at first. He mentioned slower weeks. He mentioned that the big box store 2 towns over had expanded. He mentioned that he had taken out a small loan to cover the summer ordering cycle, but that things would pick up in the fall. They didn't pick up. By 2008, he had borrowed against the house. By the spring of 2009, he was 3 months behind on the mortgage. By June, a notice had come from the bank. "I haven't told your mother the full picture," he said on a Sunday in July in a tone I hadn't heard from him before. Careful in a different way than usual, as though he was choosing each word the way you choose a step on an uncertain surface. I asked him what the full picture was. He told me. It was not a number that surprised me. I had been watching from Portland, tracking what I could see from a distance, what the recession was doing to hardware stores, what adjustable rate mortgages were doing to families who had taken them in better years, what happened to the equity in a home when someone had borrowed against it twice. I had not offered anything because he had not asked, but I had been ready for the conversation. "Dad," I said, "let me help." He protested. I knew he would. He was from a generation that had very specific ideas about what it meant for a father to receive money from his daughter, what it said about him, what it would do to her. I let him protest for 30 seconds. Then I said his name clearly and waited. He went quiet. Then he said, "Patricia, you've already done more than you know." I thought he meant the smaller contributions I'd been sending over the years, amounts I never discussed with anyone. The furnace one winter, a section of roof over the garage another year, an emergency when Derek's car broke and the family needed a rental for 2 weeks, and there was, somehow, not quite enough. Small things, nothing I mentioned or kept track of. I had assumed he used them for whatever was most urgent and said nothing further. "This is different," I said. "This is the house." "I know," he said quietly. "I know it is." We talked for a long time that Sunday. By the end of the call, I had laid out what I was thinking. He said he needed time to consider it. He called back in 4 days. I drove to Milford on a Friday in February 2010. It was cold, the kind of Pacific Northwest cold that settles into your joints by mid-morning and doesn't leave. I had a cashier's check in my briefcase and a draft document my attorney had reviewed twice. My father's attorney, a careful man named Mr. Howell, who had handled their affairs for many years, met us in an office that smelled of old paper and coffee and the particular quiet of rooms where serious things happen. My father was there when I arrived. He was sitting in a chair across from the desk, wearing his good coat, the dark wool one he wore to important occasions. He stood when I came through the door. He didn't say anything immediately. He just looked at me for a moment. What I saw in his face was not just gratitude, it was relief. The specific relief of someone who has been carrying a weight alone for a long time and has finally, at some cost to his pride, allowed another person to help bear it. The deed of trust was straightforward. I purchased the property outright, the remaining mortgage balance, the arrears, the legal fees, every dollar in full. The house transferred to me. I then granted my parents a life estate, the right to live there for as long as either of them was alive, with all the protections of full ownership, except the right to sell. Upon the deaths of both parents, the property would revert to me. Mr. Howell looked over his glasses and asked whether I wanted my mother notified. I said no. He paused, professionally in the way of a man who has learned that silence is sometimes the most useful thing he can offer, and waited. If she knows, I said, she spends the rest of her life feeling like a charity case. My father knows. That's what matters. Mr. Howell nodded slowly, with the nod of a man who has spent decades watching families arrange the truths they can and cannot live with. On the drive home, my father called. He said, "Patricia." Just that, with the particular weight he gave my name when he was about to say something he'd been holding for a while. Then, "I don't know how to say what this means." I told him he didn't have to. "Someday," he said, "I'll find the right words." He never did. He died 8 months after the rest of this story ends. A heart attack on a Tuesday morning in October, while my mother was at the grocery store. Sudden, complete, unmerciful in the way of sudden things. Derek found him. Derek called me. And 3 weeks after we buried him, Mr. Howell contacted me about the estate. My father had been thorough. He had kept the deed of trust in a sealed envelope with Mr. Howell's firm, with written instructions for its use, specifically in the event of a probate contest. His will directed the house to me, not to Derek and not to my mother, to me, and referenced the sealed document as supplementary. His remaining assets were divided carefully, savings split equally between Derek and me, his tools and his car left to Derek, a few specific pieces of furniture noted for people who had admired them over the years. It was a will that reflected exactly what had happened and why. It was also, I knew the moment I read it, going to create a problem. My mother received the will 3 weeks after the funeral. I was not there. She called me at 7 in the morning. She did not say hello. She said, "You did this." I said, "Mom, Dad wrote his own will." She said, "You turned him against his family." I thought about the February drive, the cashier's check, Mr. Howell's quiet office, my father in his good coat, standing when I came through the door, 23 years of Sunday calls at 11. I said, "That is not what happened." She said she wanted to talk in person. I flew home the following weekend. We sat at the same kitchen table where I had eaten breakfast every morning of my childhood, the one with the slight wobble on the left leg that no one had ever quite fixed, that had been there since I was 8, that would probably be there after everything else in that house was gone. And my mother told me calmly and with complete certainty that the house should go to Derek, that Derek had been present, that Derek had made the sacrifices that proximity requires, that I had spent my adult life making choices for myself, and that choosing yourself meant accepting what you gave up. She said all of it without raising her voice, without cruelty. She believed every word. "Mom," I said, "there are things about the house you don't know." She said, "I've lived in that house for 45 years. I know everything about it." I sat with that for a moment. I thought about telling her. I seriously considered laying out the full truth, the 2009 crisis, the missed mortgage payments, the bank notice, the February drive, the deed, the arrangement my father had made and kept. I thought about what it would cost her, not just her pride, but her understanding of herself, of him, of what their life together had actually looked like from the inside versus what she believed it had looked like. I thought about what it means to a woman who has always understood herself as the anchor of her family to discover that the anchor had been quietly replaced for 16 years without her knowing. Maybe I should have told her. Maybe a different version of me would have. I made the choice I made. I think we should let the estate process handle it, I said. She looked at me. Fine, she said. We will. She hired an attorney 2 weeks later. The months between the filing and the hearing were not easy months. My mother is a woman who knows 300 people by name. She had been at First Methodist for 35 years. She had organized food drives and sat with people who were dying and shown up at funerals and remembered birthdays and done all the work of community that holds a town together. She was, in the truest sense of the phrase, beloved in her community. And she was absolutely certain she was right. When someone who is genuinely beloved is absolutely certain they are right, the combination is very effective. Within 6 weeks of the filing, I started receiving messages from people I hadn't spoken to in years. A woman who had lived 2 doors down from my parents when I was in high school. She had heard things were difficult. She hoped we could find a way through. My mother's Sunday school teacher from 30 years ago. She had known our family a long time. She wanted me to know that. A cousin twice removed I had not spoken to since a wedding more than a decade ago. None of the messages were hostile, exactly. They were expressed as concern, as checking in, as wanting to make sure I knew how things looked from where they were standing. What they had heard was that Patricia, who had always been the distant one, the one who left, the one who sent checks and called it Family B, was now trying to take her elderly mother's house after her father's death, that Helen had given her whole life to that house, that it was a difficult situation, and they hoped I would consider what was right. I didn't correct anyone. I didn't call the cousin or the neighbor or my mother's Sunday school teacher. I didn't ask Rachel to write letters. I went back to Portland, did my work, and waited. Rachel Park, my attorney, was less calm about it than I was. The difficulty, she told me in her measured, precise way, is that your mother presents very well. She is sympathetic. She has standing in her community. She has a son who will testify on her behalf, and she has lived in that house for 45 years. Judges are human beings. Emotional testimony moves them. It shouldn't, but it does, and particularly when the emotional testimony is delivered by a woman who is clearly not performing, who genuinely believes what she is saying. The estate file stays sealed. I cannot tell the court what's in it. I can note that the estate attorney submitted supplementary documentation, but without the judge choosing to review it, that means very little. So what do? We let her make her case, Rachel said, and then we ask the judge to review the complete estate file, and we trust that what's in it does the work. I sat with that for a moment. That requires me to sit there and say nothing while she testifies. Yes, Rachel said, it does. And if the judge doesn't open the envelope? Rachel was quiet for a beat. Then we're in a harder position. But the law is clear that the court can review any document filed to the estate, and a deed of record is the kind of document judges take seriously. She paused. Your father was thorough, Patricia. Trust that he thought this through. Rachel reached out to my mother's attorney in December to explore whether there was any settlement the family could agree to. She told me the conversation lasted less than 10 minutes. My mother's attorney said his client was not interested in settlement, he said, and Rachel reported this to me carefully, the way she reported things she wanted me to hear accurately, that his client believed the estate documents were being challenged and that the house was rightfully hers, and that she was prepared to testify to that effect. Rachel said she had not argued the point. She thanked him for his time and ended the call. She told me about it on a Friday afternoon. I listened, and then I said nothing for a moment, and then I said, "Okay." She said, "I thought you should know." I said I was glad she had tried. After we hung up, I sat at my desk for a few minutes. I thought about calling my mother directly, not through attorneys, not through the estate process, just calling her and telling her what she didn't know. I thought about what she would do with it. whether she would believe me, whether she would feel relief, or whether she would feel the kind of shame that doesn't have anywhere to go except sideways, into something else. I put my phone down and went back to my work. I tried to speak to Derek once in January, 2 months before the hearing date. I called on a Sunday evening. He answered, which surprised me. We talked for about 10 minutes, carefully, politely, about things that didn't matter. He mentioned that the front porch railing was starting to loosen and asked if I had arranged for winter maintenance on the property. I said I had. He said, okay. Neither of us mentioned the case, the attorney, our mother's campaign, or the fact that we were going to see each other in a courtroom in March. At the end of the call, he said, I hope this gets resolved, Patty. He hadn't called me Patty since we were teenagers. I didn't know what to do with that, so I didn't do anything. I said I hoped so, too. He didn't call again before the hearing, and I didn't call him. I flew to Milford the night before. I stayed at a hotel because the house was occupied. I had rented it shortly after the estate filing to a young couple who were both teachers and needed a stable place at a fair rate. I drove past it once that evening, on no particular errand, just because I was in the neighborhood and couldn't not. The lights were on in the kitchen. Someone had put a wreath on the front door, a winter one with dried berries. The dogwood tree stood in the front yard exactly as it always had. I sat in the car for a minute, then drove back to the hotel. The morning of the hearing, I put on the suit I wear to federal project reviews, the dark gray one that means I am prepared and intend to be taken seriously. My folder contained a blank legal pad and a pen. Everything that needed to be said was already in Mr. Howell's sealed envelope, already in the court file. I had nothing to argue. I had nothing to prove. The proof had been a matter of public record since March of 2010. Rachel met me on the courthouse steps. She looked at my folder. Nothing in there? Nothing I need, I said. She studied me for a moment with the particular attention of someone who is trying to decide whether to trust a situation she can't control. Then she nodded. My mother arrived with Derek and her pastor and the 3 church women. She was dressed in navy blue, carefully chosen. She moved the way she had moved since her hip surgery 3 years earlier, with full, deliberate attention to each step, but she moved with purpose. She saw me across the lobby. She held my gaze for 2 seconds, long enough to communicate something that did not need to be said out loud. The judge was a man named Caldwell, in his late 50s, with the unhurried manner of someone who has spent many years listening to people argue about things that could have been settled privately. He reviewed the filings without comment, acknowledged both attorneys, and asked my mother's counsel to proceed. Her attorney was younger than I expected, early 40s, composed with the kind of ease that comes from knowing your client presents well. He laid out the timeline methodically. 45 years in the house, 2 children raised there, a community built around it. He called Derek first. Derek testified quietly. He had been there every week, he said. He had helped with repairs and with the yard and with the things that come up when a house gets older and the people in it get older too. He had been there when their father was sick and when their mother needed help after the hip surgery and during every difficult season of the last 20 years. The house was his mother's home. It would be wrong to take it from her. He said all of this without drama and without looking at me, and it was true. All of it. He had been there. He had helped. I am not in the business of erasing that. Then her attorney called my mother. She sat in the witness chair with her hands folded in her lap. She answered each question clearly without theatrics. She spoke about my father, how hard he had worked, how much he loved that house, the garden he tended, the neighbors he had known for 40 years. She spoke about Derek, his consistency, his presence through difficult seasons. And then her attorney asked her about me. She paused. She looked at her hands for a moment. When she looked up, she looked not at her attorney, but directly at me. Patricia is my daughter, she said. I love her. But she made choices. She left at 25 and she built her life somewhere else. And she would send money sometimes, as though money were the same thing as being present, as though a check in the mail replaces what it means to actually be there. A slight, controlled shake of her head. She was never useful to this family. Not in the ways that count. She was never present. And now she's sitting in this courtroom to claim the house that her father and I built our life around, and I have to explain why that isn't right. Her voice stayed level. It didn't waver. I shouldn't have to explain it. It should be obvious to anyone who understands what family means. The courtroom was very quiet. One of the church women pressed a hand to her chest. The pastor nodded, once, slowly. Derek stared at the table in front of him. My mother's attorney thanked her. She returned to her seat. I had expected her testimony to be hard to sit through. I had prepared myself as carefully as I could prepare for what it would feel like to hear my mother say those things about me in front of a judge, in front of her community, in front of my brother. I had told myself in the hotel room the night before that I knew the truth and the truth would hold, and that what she said in a courtroom couldn't change what had actually happened in the world. I was right about that, and it was still hard. Not because what she said was cruel. It wasn't cruel in the way that cruelty requires a knowledge of what it's doing. It was harder than cruelty in its way. It was a mother who genuinely believed what she was saying, who had constructed a story over many years and lived inside it, and who was now telling that story to a judge with the full conviction of someone who has never had reason to doubt it. The certainty of it was the thing, the lack of any flicker of doubt. I was aware, in that moment, of exactly how it looked from the outside. A 73-year-old woman who had lived in a house for 45 years, who had been there for every difficult thing, whose community had come to support her. And across from her, the daughter who had left, who was offering nothing in her own defense. I knew how it looked. I had known how it would look. I sat with my hands flat on either side of my empty folder, and I let it look however it looked. Judge Caldwell turned to Rachel. She stood. "Your Honor, I have a brief cross. Following that, I'd like to ask the court to review the complete estate file, including the sealed supplementary document submitted by the estate attorney." My mother's attorney was on his feet immediately. "Objection. The sealed document was submitted without notice to opposing counsel." It was submitted by the decedent's estate attorney as a component of the formal probate record, Rachel said without raising her voice. Under probate code, this court has full authority to review any document filed to the estate. Judge Caldwell raised one hand. Both attorneys sat. He looked at Mr. Howell, seated to the side of the gallery. "Mr. Howell, can you describe the nature of the sealed submission?" Mr. Howell stood carefully. He was close to 70 now, deliberate in the way of men who have learned to be deliberate about everything. "Your Honor, it is a real property document, executed, notarized, and recorded in the county public record, submitted to this court per my late client's explicit written instructions, to be opened in the event of a probate contest." The judge looked at the sealed envelope on the bench. He looked at both attorneys. He said, "I'll review it." My mother leaned toward Derek. He put his phone face down on the table. The judge opened the envelope himself without ceremony. He read the first page in silence, turned to the second, stopped, read something again, slowly. He looked up at Mr. Howell. "This is a deed of trust?" "Yes, Your Honor. Dated February." He glanced at the page. "February 14th, 2010. Correct. And the grantor is..." He read the name. "Patricia Ann Abernathy." The room shifted in a way that had no sound attached to it. "Mr. Howell," the judge said, "in plain terms, what does this document establish?" Mr. Howell stood. In February of 2010, Patricia Abernathy purchased the property at 14 Sycamore Lane, paying the outstanding mortgage balance, the arrears, and all associated legal fees, in full with a certified cashier's check. She then executed a deed of trust granting her parents a life estate in the property, with reversion to herself upon the deaths of both parents. The deed was recorded with the county recorder's office in March of 2010 and has been part of the public record since that date. Judge Caldwell set the papers down carefully. He did not look at my mother. He looked at me. "Ms. Abernathy," he said, "when did you purchase this property?" "February 14th, 2010, Your Honor." "And your father was present for the execution of the deed?" "He was. He was a party to the arrangement." "And your mother?" I held the judge's gaze. My father felt it was better if she wasn't informed. The judge was quiet for a moment. He picked up the papers again and turned to something near the end of the document. "There is a letter here as well," he said with a slight change in his voice, "from the decedent." My mother made a sound, small, just once, like something released without her intending to release it. The judge read the letter. He read it fully, without hurrying. The room waited. When he finished, he set it down with a particular care. The way you set something down when it deserves that attention. I learned later what the letter said. Mr. Howell told me. My father had written it 6 years before his death and updated it once. It described the arrangement plainly and explained his reasoning. The last paragraph was about the Sunday phone calls, about what they had been to him and what he had never quite found the right words to say. He had written, "She has been, in every way that mattered, the most reliable person in my life." I should have found a way to tell her that directly, while I still could. I had not known the letter existed. I had not asked. Judge Caldwell set his hands flat on the bench. "Counsel for the contestant? Is there anything you'd like to say before I rule?" My mother's attorney leaned toward her and said something quietly. She didn't respond to whatever it was. She was looking at me with an expression I had not seen on her face before. Not anger, not contempt, not the carefully maintained certainty of the past 8 months. Something older than all of that. The look of someone whose story has just been rearranged around them and who hasn't yet found the new shape of it. "No, Your Honor," her attorney said. The judge spoke directly, without preamble. "The property at 14 Sycamore Lane has been the legal property of Patricia Ann Abernathy since March of 2010. The decedent's will reflects this accurately. The motion to contest is denied." The pastor stopped nodding. The churchwoman with her hand on her chest dropped it to her lap. Another one was looking at the floor. Derek picked up his phone, set it down, turned it face down. My mother sat very still for a moment. Then she stood, slowly, deliberately, and she walked toward the aisle. She passed within 4 feet of me. She did not look at me. Her pastor put a hand on her back and guided her toward the door. The church women followed. My mother's attorney asked for a brief recess. Judge Caldwell denied it. He had 2 other matters that morning. Rachel gathered her papers without comment. I closed my empty folder. The court officer called all rise, and the room began the quiet, uncomfortable process of people who do not know how to exit a situation they had not prepared for. Derek came toward me from across the room. He stopped a few feet away, as though he had changed his mind mid-step about what he was going to do. He said, "I didn't know." I said, "I know you didn't." He nodded once. He picked up his jacket and walked out without speaking to our mother or the pastor or anyone else. Mr. Howell found me in the hallway. He was carrying his thin leather briefcase, and he had the look of a man who has been carrying something for a long time and has finally, at the right moment, set it down. He said, "He was proud of you. He asked me to say that when the time came." I said, "He told me, in his way." He also left this. He handed me a small envelope, the kind used for personal note cards, with my name written on it in my father's handwriting. Precise, old-fashioned, slightly formal, the way he wrote everything that mattered. I put it in my coat pocket. I didn't open it until the plane was over the Rockies, in the dark, with the other passengers asleep around me and the mountains invisible below. Inside was a single index card in his careful print. "Patricia, thank you for the house. I hope it gives back more than you put in. I read it twice. I folded it and put it back in the envelope and held it in both hands for a while. Then I put it in the inside pocket of my coat, close to me, and looked out at the dark until I fell asleep. That was 14 months ago. The house on Sycamore Lane is rented now to the young couple. Both teachers. Their first child born in August, a boy they named after the town where she grew up, which I thought was exactly the kind of thing that belongs in a house like that one. They send photographs sometimes, a bird feeder they hung from the dogwood tree, a new coat of paint on the front door in a green I would not have chosen, but which looks right. The garden coming in during spring, something they have been quietly working on since they moved in, not because anyone asked them to, but because they are people who tend things. They pay below what the market asks. When we signed the lease, I told them I hoped they would stay a long time. They seemed genuinely surprised that a landlord would say that. I didn't explain. Derek called 6 months after the hearing. It was a Sunday. He called at 11, which I don't believe was accidental. He said he had been thinking for a long time about what happened, talking to some people he trusted, doing some reading, and that he understood now what had occurred in 2010 and what it had meant. He said he was sorry he hadn't asked more questions when questions were still possible. He said our mother was staying with him and his wife and was managing day by day. I said I was glad she had him. He said, "She hasn't called you?" No. We left it there. Neither of us pushed further, and we didn't need to. There are things I have spent time thinking about since the hearing, whether I should have told her years before any of this what I had done, whether she deserved the truth more than she deserved the version of herself she had been living in, whether the years I spent not reaching quite far enough across that distance were years I could have spent differently. They might have been. I made the choices I made, and I don't claim they were all right. But there are other things I think about too. The way he said my name at the beginning of a sentence when he had been sitting with something. The look on his face when I walked into Mr. Howell's office on that February afternoon. The particular weight of a phone call at 11 on a Sunday. How dependable it was. How much it held. How much of a life can be conducted in that kind of quiet constancy. I still reach for my phone on Sunday mornings, around 11 before I remember. Some things you stop waiting for and start carrying instead. You learn the difference between the two, and you find that carrying is lighter than it sounds. He was right about one thing in the end. The house has given back more than I put in, not in any way you can measure. In an index card in old-fashioned print, in the knowledge that someone had been paying attention all along, quietly and without announcement, and had trusted, without ever saying so, that I would be there when it mattered. That was enough. That has always been enough. Some things don't need to be said twice.